All right, Scott, take us away.
Great. Welcome, everyone, to Electronic Records Day 2021. We have a very relevant topic today for all of us. I think all of us have dealt with COVID-19 electronic records or are trying to deal with them this year and the past year and a half. So our panelists are going to talk about how to manage our COVID-19 electronic records. Our first panelist is Jackie Diorio. Jackie is a records management subject matter expert. She's been working in records management at UCOP for 4 years and in university records management for 8. She splits her time between tinkering and on-base, working to improve records management practices at UCOP, looking for the most interesting items in UCOP's electronic archive, and petting her pug, Bug. Before coming to UC, she was a university archivist at Marshall University, and she received her master's degree in the science of information from the University of Michigan. Our next expert is from our privacy community. Jennifer Loftus is working in ECAS, Ethics, Compliance, and Audit Services at UCOP. Jennifer is new to UCOP this year as a general compliance manager. She assists the system-wide privacy officer in coordinating campus privacy initiatives, among other compliance projects. Prior to UCOP, she served as an ADA policy and compliance officer at UC Santa Barbara from 2016 to 2021. And before that, she practiced civil litigation with a small firm in Santa Barbara. Jennifer loves all things compliance, cooking, and Jane Austen, and spends her free time with her husband and daughter, aptly named Austin, enjoying the great outdoors. Finally, from our university archives community, we have Matt Stahl. Matt Stahl has been the UCSB University Archivist since 2017. Prior to this, he served as the inaugural archivist for the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation from 2013 to 2017. Matt also has an extensive background in secondary and higher education, having worked as an academic advisor at the University of Maryland and as a history and economics teacher in the South Pasadena Unified School District in California. He holds an MA in history and a master's degree in library science, both from the University of Maryland. I think Jackie will get us started.
Yes, and just FYI, please feel free to put questions in the chat and we will tackle them at the end. All right, so now I'm going to share my screen and you guys will have to tell me if I am sharing the right thing, of course. Oh, that is. Okay. All right, are you guys seeing the PowerPoint? Okay, great. All righty. Well, thank you guys so much for coming today. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about COVID records retention. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about records retention in general, and then I'll talk about how we came up with retention for COVID records specifically. So a little background, what's a record? And so here's a definition from RMP2, which is one of the policies on records management at UC. And basically, it's anything that records, university business that's prepared or used by a university employee or for UC. The UC records retention is at records retention at ucop.edu. That's where you can find the retention schedule. It's established by RMP1, but also by RMP2. It's overseen by the UC Records Management Committee, who helps establish all the retention that UC follows. It applies to all of the employees of UC, but actually doesn't apply to all the records of UC. Administrative records is what it applies to specifically. So it doesn't apply to medical records, also doesn't apply to like research records. It also doesn't apply to anything held by the regents. So anything held by the secretary of the regents or anything under a regental officer like UC Legal. There can be local exceptions to it. So the retention schedule says you have to keep things at least this long, but it is possible if you need to keep something longer, you can get a local exception for it at your campus. So we always say if you have any questions, you should speak to your local records management coordinator, your person on the UC Records Management Committee. And if you feel like you need a local exception, also please reach out to those people and we can get that established for you if necessary. It's a minimum and maximum retention schedule. Some retention schedules say, you have to keep things 5 years, but no longer than 10. Ours is just a set length. It's also media and device neutral. So it doesn't matter where the record is or what the format it's in, it's all still record held and belonging to the Regents of the University of California. Here's what the retention schedule looks like. I encourage you to go look at it. You can see there's a variety of hyperlinks here. And those, if you click on them, they expand to show additional information, such as citations or additional context about what the records are. So how do we make the retention schedule? In the past, when people would make retention schedules, they tended to think like, oh, I have this document, and I have this document, and this document. I had to figure out the retentions for those. But going that way means you end up with these super long lists that are kind of impossible to update. So instead, we do something called a big bucket retention schedule. And so basically then you kind of look at things functionally and figure out where they go, which bucket they go into. So instead of saying, okay, this is a receipt for air travel, instead you think, okay, this is a receipt that supports, travel. So it's all the things sort of go into that function. And that makes it easier to sort of put new records into these buckets instead of having to always very specifically think about what each record is. When we start to make a new portion for the retention schedule or update one, we reach out to and find subject matter experts from across the UCs because we want to make sure we get all the viewpoints of the people using the records to do this. And then there are 4 main components that go into determining retention. One, we're going to look at what's the business need. How long do you need to keep it for your business requirements? And that's going to be determined by our subject matter experts. 2, are there any related laws that govern retention? So for example, California obviously has privacy laws that are super relevant. Where's the money coming from? Things that are funded by grants have to be kept longer than things that are funded by state funds. And lastly, is it historically significant? Is this something that someone's going to want to look at in 50 to 100 years? Why is records retention important? So first of all, of course, we have to follow laws and regulations. It's kind of required to. It also protects us from additional costs in lawsuits and for public and record act requests. Basically, if the retention schedule is all up to date and legally good and stuff, and you follow the retention schedule and you get rid of something, if a lawsuit comes up and they say, well, we need this record, if you followed all the procedures correctly, then you're fine. You just say, well, we disposed of those according to our rules and I can't provide it to you. But if you've kept those records, even if they were supposed to be disposed of, you then will have to go through them to provide them for said lawsuit or public record request. So if you keep something you don't need to, you could be setting yourself up for more work down the road, having to go through that stuff. It also keeps, of course, the cost of storage and retrieval down. And lastly, preserves history. So when we looked at the COVID records, we kind of said, what kind of records do we have here? So we kind of figured out that these records fell into a couple basic categories. So you've got self-screening records, the quiz you have to take in to go into the office saying you feel all right. Testing records, of course, there's contract tracing, but of course, people are taking COVID-19 related leave. And now lastly, we now newly have vaccination records. So we kind of had to go at this and we're, the records management committee is chatting and we're like, are these actually new records or do they fit somewhere into our schedule? We at first thought they might actually be new records. But then we realized, for COVID-19 related leave, we're like, well, actually that's a leave record. We already have something in the retention schedule for a leave record. And additionally, there's also anything that's related to leave, of course, especially with credits, is that a payroll record? One of our records management committee members also pointed out, like, wait, actually, we've been through some of this before, unfortunately. We had a measles outbreak. So, where did we put the measles outbreak records? And then, of course, lastly, my boss, Lori Slatton, is actually the one who did a lot of this work. I know she just did like tons of research. She looked at all the laws. She talked to all the lawyers. She looked at what other places were doing. And she just really said, okay, where should all these live? And so we figured out at the end of the day that actually all the records were already covered by our existing retention schedule. That's why we made the buckets. Everything fits neatly into a bucket with a few little modifications. So for example, if we look at self-screening records, and I hope you love the transitions I've used here. Okay, so self-screening records, you have a couple records here. One, when you take that quiz saying, I feel good to go in, you get an email sent to your email. Like I get one every time I go in. Do I need this long-term? Probably not. This is a general office transfer record. I only need to know if I can go in today, right? And then we've got one that may be sent to my supervisor. And again, do we need that one long-term? Probably not. I mean, especially if you pass, you just need to know if you can go in that day. But then, maybe that record, that quiz says means that you can't go in and you also can't work from home. So now you have to take leave. And this leave could impact service credits. So now we're talking, this is a payroll record. If it doesn't impact service credits, it's still a payroll record. It's just a different category. So, so that's where those records would go. And then it keeps going. If you're academic personnel and it impacts your service credits or leave in general, those are a different category, but it's still, that falls into a different bucket. But basically the way we figured it out is that all of these, when we broke it down, fit into some of our existing buckets and that we didn't need to create new buckets for them. So this is what basically we ended up creating something called the crosswalk. And the crosswalk basically just says, here's all the records we think that you will run into with COVID records. And here's where we've mapped it to the retention schedule and why we've done that. And if there's any additional relevant citations related therein. So for example, here there's a citation related to the ADA because that matters to the crosswalk. I know OSHA also has very specific requirements. Also in here, we'll note where things aren't considered covered by the retention. So if something involves, more of a medical record taken by a medical facility, that's not, maybe something covered in the crosswalk because our retention schedule only covers administrative records. But I encourage you to go look at it. As you can see here, it was last updated December 11th. Lori's about to update it again because now we are also keeping vaccination records. So that will also be in there going forward. So here's my contact. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this. And if you feel like anything isn't covered by the crosswalk and you'd like it to be, please let us know. It's a living document and we're always updating it. Or we'll continue to update it. So just let us know and we'll try to figure out where your item lives. So thank you so much. And now I will kick it over to Matt.
All right, let me share my screen as one does. And thumbs up, everyone can see it. Yes. All right. So my name's Matt Saul. I'm the University Archivist at UC Santa Barbara. And what I'm going to be talking about is kind of when you look at the records retention schedule, there are items in there that are marked permanent. Most of those items marked permanent are items that should be at some point transferred to the university archives. Not in every case. There are things marked permanent that should say where they are, including public safety records, student records, things like that. Those things should not come to the university archives, but that's one way to determine if a document you have in your collection in your office is permanent, is if it says so in the retention schedule. Let's see, how do I advance? Click, okay, there we go. For some reason, I actually have to click it to advance. Okay, so what I wanted to take a look at first is just a look back at history, and this was actually from an article that was written by Rex W. Adams in 1998, published in the Chronicle of the University of California, I believe was the title of the publication. And this was found by Jenny Loftus a few weeks ago, so thank you, Jenny. But Rex Adams wrote an article kind of demonstrating how record of the 1918 pandemic were used at the University of California and kind of in California in general as well. I mean, you see a lot of the same issues of masks must be worn in campus buildings, symptoms and prevention of, how to prevent. This is actually a message from Benjamin Wheeler, who was UC president at the time, and political cartoon from the Daily Californian in November 1918. So kind of the question is, these are the items that were, that we, some examples of items that could be used to write the history of the 1918 pandemic. A lot of these are actual physical relics, but where are the items that will allow someone 100 years from now to write the history of the 2020 pandemic at the University of California? So as you know, the pandemic, it pushed things online and remote kind of faster than would have normally happened. I think all of a sudden, communication about the pandemic was handled through memos blasted on the website, memos blasted through email, kind of to the entire campus community. This is actually a web crawl of the UCSB Office of the Chancellor memos page. I assume there is something similar at each campus. So, one of the ways that we decided to capture all these memos that were coming out with, periodic web archiving of this page, as well as other pages. And for example, I don't know about other campuses, but the UCSB Daily Nexus, our campus newspaper, actually ceased physical publication for well over a year. They are back to publishing daily physical papers now, but for over a year, they were completely online. So in order to capture the Daily Nexus, we also implemented web crawls. Now, I know that the Daily Nexus or campus newspaper wouldn't necessarily fall under university record, but it is something that your university archives will be collecting. So not only were traditional means of communicating information kind of pushed online, we had entire rites of passage pushed online as well. I know UC Santa Barbara had in 2020 virtual graduation. I'm assuming other campuses did the same. So, all of a sudden, these students who had worked so hard to earn their degree from the University of California were kind of forced to celebrate remotely and online. So one way to capture that, again, we did do a web crawl of the virtual celebration website, which is actually still up. Now, no discussion of electronic records and archiving would be complete without just kind of a quick mention of what we call legacy media. Probably many of you on this call are too young to, I don't know, have seen things like, let's see, you may have seen a 3.5-inch floppy. I don't know if you would have seen a 4 1/4. But I would be willing to kind of bet my, maybe not my whole salary, maybe a month or so, that for the most part, very few of you, with the exception of maybe an external solid state hard drive, have actually touched any of these items within the last year. Probably, again, the external hard drive you might have. But one thing that this kind of shows is how, you know, I don't know if you remember back in 2003 or so, everyone was kind of, well, at least I was buying these like iOmega zip disk, and you would just put all your files on the iOmega zip disk, and voila, you're done. You think your files are safe forever. But this kind of demonstrates the, you know, some of the problems with changing technology is now it's very difficult to actually access files that were saved on these zip disks. Similar, I don't have a CD-ROM on here, but again, that are most of your computers right now. So kind of in the 2010 area, a lot of people were, you know, putting a lot of files on CD-ROM, thinking that, you know, these will be safe forever, not realizing that that material breaks down, and also that within like 5 to 6 years, it would not be possible to even buy a computer with the optical drive on it. So this is kind of getting into the weeds of digital preservation, which I don't necessarily want to do. What I want to do is talk to you about kind of how a lot of us have been working over the last year. As I said, most of you have probably not even touched any of those items on the previous page for a year or so, if not longer. But we've been working in shared spaces. Online Google Drives is kind of what we've used most frequently at the UCSB library. And, you know, I know there's other forums available. Some people, some offices with a little higher budget, I guess, might have been using something like SharePoint or something like that. But the cost for Google Drive is just about right for us. Here's another example. Also, Box is one thing we've been using, you know, to kind of share and collaborate. Now, as Jackie mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter where the records are stored or what format they're stored in, what format they're created in. A record is a record regardless of its format and where it's stored. And the same is true of permanently valuable records that should be transferred to the university archives. Yeah, here's just another example of collaboration. One of the, actually, let me go back to this. So one of the things that I found out kind of over the last decade or so of working in this field is just that you can kind of tell people the best way to do things from an archival standpoint, the best way to, you know, make sure that all the necessary metadata is being preserved and everything like that. But the fact is people are going to do what they're going to do. And as an archivist and as university archivist, it's my job to kind of figure out and help you figure out the best way to preserve these documents that should be transferred to the archives. Printing them out is not the best way to do that. You know, and at UCSB, we've been ramping up to receive electronic records. And actually, over the last couple of months, we've received at least 2 or 3 collections that all exist in just a Google Share Drive. No actual physical material to be transferred. It's all electronic. Similarly, email is kind of a large monster for us in the UC records community and the archives community right now, just because there's not really a clear policy on how to archive or what should be archived. So we're kind of hoping to develop that. But the reason it can create so many problems, and I imagine Jenny is going to talk about this, there's privacy issues involved with email that doesn't necessarily come in with other records. There is kind of mixed up in someone's email account is just kind of all kinds of different category records, from transitory records like, hey, we're moving this meeting from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. You don't need to save that. That's not permanently valuable. But I don't know, for example, there's really nothing in here, I don't think, but just a notice, or if I were to send back and forth kind of a memo or something that we're writing to try and document some type of historical event or whatever. That the point is that could all be kind of contained in the same email universe here. And as I mentioned, you can tell people how to organize their email, but at the end of the day, people are going to do what they're going to do, myself included, because as you can see, I have all these nice little categories over here on the side, but I also have almost 2,000, almost 3,000 unsorted emails that kind of either need to be deleted or moved into one of these categories. So guilty as charged. All right, so in spirit of Halloween, I went with the who are you gonna call? And actually then you can see email is better, please. But these are the university archivists at the respective campuses. If you have any questions about transferring electronic records to the university archives, please find your campus and note the name and get in touch with them. There are 10 of us, and we are all more than happy to help you. Any questions? Although we're actually saving questions to the end, so David Pumpkins will have to wait. All right, now I'm going to hand it off to Jenny.
Hello, everybody. Let me go ahead and pull up my screen here. Here we go. Okay, so my portion of this this talk today is slightly different lens. What we're looking at is privacy compliance in the COVID era and beyond. We're going to talk about practical tips for staying compliant with UC privacy policies when you're collecting sensitive information, i.e. when you are creating administrative records. We're going to do this through the lens of a specific policy, the vaccination program policy, because we are talking about COVID records today. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to talk about how we're handling records from the point of the collection all the way down through to you decide to destroy it and or you ship it over to Matt or your campus archivist, and how you can stay compliant with policy throughout. So the SARS-CoV-2 vaccination program policy requires that all of the university locations track and record vaccination data consistent with university privacy and security policies. But what does that mean exactly? Why are we not spelling it out? That's all the information you have in the entire policy. It just says you have to handle these electronic records or physical records, whatever they are, in accordance with other policies. The simple answer to why this policy doesn't spell it out is because policies just don't do that. Policies very rarely reiterate what other policies or laws say. So they just have these general statements that say you've got to do it consistent with X, Y, or Z. When you read this, I'm willing to bet that a number of people said, what privacy and security policies are we even talking about here? And how in the world am I going to implement them? So that is, again, what we're covering today, practical tips for ensuring your compliance with privacy policies. Although we're talking today about the context of the discussion is going to be in the vaccination policy, but do please remember that the tips here today are applicable to every single point of collection that anyone on this call has with regards to information that we take in by the university. It is not exclusive to vaccination data. Policies that you need to familiarize yourself with when you're thinking about your administrative records include RMP 7, IS 3, we've got ICAOS 130, AAPM 160, and then of course you have your records management retention program, RMP 1, RMP 2, and the schedule that goes along with it. The one that is most important to my discussion here today is going to be RMP 7. It is a policy that hopefully all of you are familiar with, or if you're not familiar with it, after this call, I suggest you download it and read through it thoroughly, because you all are responsible for compliance with it. Within RMP 7, under section 3A, is a portion of the policy called Rules of Conduct for employees with access to information concerning individuals. It is essentially a list of 7 rules that everybody must follow. And the very first rule on the list is here up on the screen, and it says employees are responsible for the collection, maintenance, use, and dissemination of administrative records that contain PII, personally identifiable information, and that you must comply with the provisions of the IPA. So what is the IPA? That is the California Information Practices Act, and it essentially expands upon California's constitutional guarantee of privacy by providing limits on the collection and management and dissemination of any personal information gathered by state agencies. So that includes the University of California, and that includes all of the data that we are generating with in regards to our vaccination program. So to comply with the IPA and to establish privacy best practices in general relating to the collection of personal data, you need to understand and implement a few things. You need to know what your data flow is. You need to make sure you're posting a privacy notice. You need to make sure that you're using data appropriately, you're accessing it appropriately or limiting access to it appropriately. You need to make sure we have sufficient security safeguards. And then of course, Jackie's favorite, our retention is also being practiced accordingly. And you need to do all of these things prior to collecting your data. And we'll talk about that more as we go through these slides. But these are things that you need to be thinking about before you start collecting. The very first question that everyone would need to ask themselves when they are collecting data, and again, when you're collecting data, you're creating an administrative record. So in case I'm kind of using the terms data and record interchangeably here. It's got a use, you're collecting it for a reason, you're creating a record. First question, what is the data that I'm collecting? What are we talking about? What's in play here? In the case of the vaccination program policy, you're talking about the submission of your vaccine data card. You're talking about any of your exception deferral information. You're talking about any outcome data, any reporting data. There's a lot of data that's going to flow out of just the one simple step of uploading your vaccine card or not, right? We have all this other thing that comes out of that. So what is the data that we are talking about? What are we collecting and where is it going? That's how we get to our data flow. Some people call it a data map. Data flow is essentially documenting, again, before you start collecting, who is going to have access, to what data, when, where, why, and how. It's the first step you're going to do once you identify what the data you're talking about is. And you need to do it before you draft your privacy notice, because your privacy notice is actually going to spell out a lot of the information that you are going to be mapping out in your data flow. So how do you create your data flow or your data map? Really, you can just ask some very simple questions. They're listed here on the screen, but context again of the vaccination program. Okay, so you have an employee and they're, or a student or a visitor, and they've uploaded, their vaccination data. What happens next, right? So what departments are going to need access to that information? Who within the department needs access to that information? What information are we going to be generating because of that piece of data that we've just collected? And where, and so on and so forth down the line. You want to know where your data points are going to be at any given time along the way. Who's going to have the vaccine data? Who can have access to the exemption deferral data? And then those outcomes, right? The outcomes could be, yes, you're cleared to come to campus, or no, you're not, or that kind of thing. Another important question is asking how you're going to minimize the transmission of data at any given stage. Minimizing data is kind of at the heart and soul of privacy. And that just basically makes you ask, what is the minimum amount of data that I need to collect in order to do this program and successfully, keep our campuses safe in the time of COVID? And what is the minimum amount of data I need to flow to each particular person along my flow chart for each job that they may have along the way. So if you're implementing a policy and you need to do it, in accordance with privacy policies as well, looking at the roles and responsibilities section of your policy and seeing who has what job and what are they supposed to be doing. And then you just go, okay, what data do they need in order to do that job? And that is the only data we're going to send along to their way. Again, then you go to where is it being stored along the way? How are you storing it safely? And of course, are we documenting this flow to our vendors so that they know how to put in the appropriate safeguards as well? So that's sort of the general data flow. It's giving you that, what data you're collecting, who needs to see it, where is it going, and when. The reason that we're doing that at the very beginning of this process is because it is required under policy and law that you put out a privacy notice anytime you're collecting information. So in the case again of the vaccination program, the data being collected was, your status of vaccination, the actual vaccine information itself, what was the date you were vaccinated, what was the type. You also need to let people know if you're pairing that information with data collected elsewhere, and what are all those sources of information that you might also be getting data on your staff or students or faculty. You need to make sure you have name and contact information. In the case, again, of the vaccine program policy, that is going to be the responsible office, the location vaccine authority. And then I say always put your campus privacy officer's information on there. They are a handy group who can assist anyone with any questions. You also need to let people know whether the submission of any of the data that you're collecting or the records you're creating about them is mandatory. And if it is mandatory and they refuse to provide that information, what are the consequences of not providing the information that you're mandating? Also, if it is a mandate, you need to say what the source of that mandate is. Moving on to the other side of the chart, number 6, purpose. This is really, really important. We need to let people know, why are we collecting this data? What are we going to use it for? And from that information, who are we foreseeably going to disclose that information to? Who are those departments on campus that you identified in your data flow that you might foreseeably be giving this information to for any of the purposes that you're listing here in the policy, in the privacy notice. And then again, security safeguards, retention, and right of access, also information that you need to put in your privacy notice, and we'll go over security safeguards and retention in just a minute. Data use, again, this goes to the purpose that we talked about in the last slide. So use of data collected, it must be limited to the use specified in the notice provided at the time of collection. And so it is absolutely imperative that when you are collecting data from people or creating records on people from information that you're gathering from them, that you thoughtfully consider any potential downstream uses of the data, and that and that your notice is accurately reflecting that. When you have people who want to use data that you've collected in a new way, you should be denying that. Unless you had foreseeably thought that that is a potential use of the data and you let someone know about it, that should be denied. And alternatively, if you feel that this is a reasonable use of the data, you really need to go and get consent from people to make sure that they are okay with you using their data in a way that went beyond the notice that you supplied to them. Data access, again, goes all the way back to the very first step with the data flow. It tells us which departments and which people need to have access to the data. You're going to let people know in the notice. And then in practice, you're actually going to limit access to the data in accordance with the notice and with the data flow that you did in the beginning. You need to make sure that you're limiting access to the least amount of information that's necessary to perform a job function. So in this case, you have a lot of people who, not a lot of people, you have people who are submitting exception, exemption, or deferral requests, and they had to provide documentation in order to seek that, right? So the person reviewing those requests needs access to all that information, but a supervisor does not need access to all that information. A supervisor only needs to know that your employee is going to be on campus or not be on campus. So that information, all of the items that are being reviewed for the deferral is going to be in one location. It is not going to transfer over to the supervisor. It's going to be segregated and stored elsewhere. Only a need to know. If you need to know the information to do your job, that's when you get access. Otherwise, the information is segregated appropriately. Data security safeguards. So when you're collecting information, you have to know how to classify the data that you're collecting under IS3. So again, in the case of vaccination data, it is classified as level P4, which is the highest protection level that we have identified in the UC because it is effectively medical information. It's highly personal, highly sensitive. If you don't know what the classification levels are under IS3, I would absolutely encourage you to engage your information security team. There is actually also a handy chart online available as well that helps classify. So you can go in there and kind of look by analogy and see how you should be classifying the data. And also engage your campus privacy officer. Again, they are very helpful in making sure that you know what your data privacy protection level is. With that information, you know how you need to secure it in accordance with IS3. So the tips for this particular one, again, engage your IT security team early and often. I would include privacy officer in that as well. Make sure that all of the places in which you're collecting data or transmitting data to different people for their different needs to use the data are secure. If you've got a vendor coming on board to help you administer anything, make sure there's Appendix DS attached to that. You need to make sure that you're implementing appropriate controls, segregating the data. Again, none of the medical information belongs in a student record or in a personnel database. Too many people can access those files. Those need to be separated into a medical file, only accessible by people with the need to know. And that's going to help prevent your unauthorized access, modification, use, or disclosure. And then also a way of monitoring to make sure that you aren't having unauthorized access to the data. Lastly, and Jackie went over this at the very beginning, the notice needs to also say what your records retention is, and you can find that information in the records retention crosswalk. It has recently been updated to include information relating to the vaccine policy. Knowing your retention ahead of time is not only going to help you comply with the IPA, because again, your notice is required to say it. It also keeps you in compliance with the UC policy, but, and I think it's probably important to this crowd in particular, when you're acting in accordance with the records retention schedule, you're cutting down on that proliferation of data and the records being here, there, and everywhere, nobody getting rid of them. They live in perpetuity. That is not a good privacy practice. In the same way that just letting the data flow to whomever, wherever, when they don't have a need to access it, not a good privacy practice. This is a little bit, we're calling it data minimization. The idea is, what is the minimum amount of data that we need to collect? What's the maximum amount of time that we need to hold on to it? We don't want data just lingering here, there, and everywhere, because we know that security breaches happen. And if the data is everywhere and it's too much, you're playing with fire there. So we want to cut back on all of that, minimize the amount of data, and hopefully that ensures that we're compliant with our policies, with our laws, and that we are honoring our commitment to safeguard the personal information of people across the system. Again, we talked about this sort of in the context of the vaccination program, but these tips are applicable to everything that you do, all electronic records, all paper records as well, for that matter, but since it's Electronic Records Day. And so hopefully this is useful in understanding what is meant when a policy says that you need to be compliant with UC policy on privacy. And I think that's it. We're back to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jennifer and Matt. And I apologize, I think there was probably some brief feedback in there for a moment when my Zoom was melting. Anyways, please put any questions you have in the chat. I was following along and did see some. I think one person asked about retention, about student records. That is covered in the retention schedule. And of course, now my computer is melting and will not show me where it is, but oh yeah, so it's, you can find student records, it's covered in category 11. So I would share my screen, but I'm afraid that my Zoom would just fail completely. But if you go to records.ucop.edu, on the side, there's a link that says browse by category. And one of the categories is student records. There's also a category for information technology records, which is category 9, because I saw a question about keeping like logs and such. So hopefully those two will answer any questions you have there. Of course, feel free to reach out if they do not. Let's see, any other questions? I see Miguel talked a lot about their scanning process. We actually just did a large scanning process ourselves, Miguel, and I think we went through probably many of the same things that you did. And thank you for those who provide the link to the retention schedule in the chat. Let's see, can you please clarify the retention schedule of the self-screening records for attestation regarding health symptoms sent solely to the employee, letting them know? Could you clarify that? So I'm not sure what to clarify there, but basically, if you get an attestation to yourself and basically it says you're allowed to go into the office, you don't need to keep anything longer than 1 year after their administrative use ceases. So for no longer than 1 year. So basically, that's not something you need to keep long term. You probably can, delete it relatively soon after receiving it if you no longer need it.
Jackie, there was a question from Shauna Morin Lanier. I don't know if you saw that one. About personnel files, like right before that.
Sure. I would love to have guidance with personnel files, what platform and what should be stored by the department. I think it's going to depend a little bit on your campus and where where the campus stores things. I know at UCOP they're stored they're stored by local HR. And platform is going to also depend on campus. We're actually now using OnBase for personnel files. The department doesn't have to store, I think, a whole lot, but I would recommend that you reach out to your local records management coordinator to get more information about that.
So there's a question from Carolyn Sheehan. She's got her hand up.
Yes, Carolyn.
I have a follow-up on this retention of the self screening. I don't know, I take it, I trash it. I had no idea anybody's supposed to keep it, or I was supposed to keep it for a year. Is this common knowledge and I just have missed it somewhere? Or I don't think anybody I know knows this.
I don't feel like you need to keep those all that long. You know, the transitory record ones, that category is kind of just for things that are of passing importance. So I wouldn't keep it. It basically says I wouldn't keep it a longer than a year from after your administrative use ceases. So I interpreted that as, you know, no longer than 1 year if your administrative use ceases, and shorter than that, you know, don't keep it longer than a year. So I guess if you do get rid of it quickly, I would say that's probably fine. Of course, my boss Larry will probably watch this later and disagree with me. So, you know, I don't think you need to keep those very long. I think you're probably doing all right. How do we handle, let's see, we got a variety of questions here. What are other people using? I think you're asking about personnel files, Miguel. So we use OnBase. I'm not sure what everyone else is doing. How do we handle COVID vaccine info for events with visitors to campus? That's a good question. So we're updating the crosswalk right now to include vaccine information. So I'm not sure off the top of my head what category that would fall to, or what bucket, or if we have a corresponding bucket. But I would encourage you to stay tuned because that'll be updated soon. And I assume that is covered by the new crosswalk. If it isn't, I will definitely make sure that it is. Right, have we missed any other questions? I'm sorry, the chat, you know, there's a lot of chat back and forth. So please feel free to retype something if you're still looking for guidance.
If I could just make one quick point, Jackie,
Sure.
As far as the COVID vaccine info, I think what you want to remember with the COVID info or with any record is, you know, it really depends on how you're using that record. If you're collecting, you know, if you've got a list of people who are cleared that, you know, they're cleared or something, you know, that record might be something that you hold on administratively for some sort of reporting mechanism, or maybe you're going to hold on to it because, you know, you want to make sure that there aren't any outbreaks at that particular event, or you have, you know, a record of what you did that you're going to hold on to for X amount of time to show that, you know, you took all the necessary precautions. You know, that's going to be different from like the employee record that's like, oh, I'm here for just today only. That's something that could be tossed the next day because you're only needing it for that day. So, you know, remember that the whole records retention schedule is, you know, what am I using it for specifically? The same document could actually fall into 4 different categories and be used for 4 different records for 4 different reasons. So it's not necessarily static. This is how long you hold on to it. It's what it's used for.
I think that's a really good point and a really good explanation. Yeah, and so those attestations, you know, it really depends on what you're using it for. If you're only in for, if it's just to say, I can go in today and you get a positive, maybe you don't need it very long. But if you can't go in that day, but then, so you have to take leave, now we're in a different category of record. It's different use for that record. It's showing that it's preventing me from doing my job for today, right? So yeah, I would definitely follow what Jennifer had said there.
And Jackie, if I could, it's from the, most of these items in the crosswalk from the University Archives perspective are not something that we would necessarily want, just because, you know, it involves basically the 3 things we intentionally avoid collecting in the University Archives, meaning student data, student records, personnel records and health records and things like that. But all that to say, University Archives might be interested in aggregate data from these items, or from if your student health center has aggregate data or anything like that, like how many people were infected or how many cases, just as long as it stayed away from individual information.
I see Andrea is looking for information on audit log records. That's a really good question. I don't know that offhand, but I think I will contact you after this and we will chat with Lori and figure out where that would live exactly. Alrighty, if we don't have any more questions, we're about out of time. So thank you guys so much for coming today. I hope this was informative. It was recorded, so we will be putting a recording on the website at some point. We'll have to caption it first. And Miguel, you can always feel free to reach out to us any other time from the Records Management Committee. You don't have to wait a whole year to chat with us again. Please let us know if you need anything, and thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.
Thank you.